Tonight we're going to talk about judging. And I hope you won't judge me until I'm through, because there may be some things you're going, what in the world is he talking about? And the truth of the matter is, I probably don't know. But don't judge me yet. I enrolled in Abilene Christian in 1966, and I found out that in my dorm there were several guys who were on the judging team. And I thought, the judging team? Well, they go to stock shows and they learn how to judge cattle and various things like that. And I thought, I watched a little of that on TV, and I thought, I have no idea what they're doing. I mean, yep, that's a cow, but how is it different from that other cow? I don't know. Chickens. They judge chickens. To me, the only choice in chickens is either regular or crispy. I mean, that's the only thing I know about judging, making a difference in chickens, okay?
White or dark.
Yeah. White or dark. That's a good one, Paul. Yeah, I could decide that. How many of you ever watched the Westminster Dog Show? Yeah. I don't ever watch the whole thing, but usually on Good Morning America, they show the last round where the final guy is chosen. Now, I understand when they've got 50 dachshunds, why they can judge one dachshund from another. But for best in show, they may have a dachshund and a boxer and a mastiff. Which is the best dog? Careful.
I want to say one thing. It's just like curling.
They couldn't hear it. Repeat what Paul said.
Well, it'll make no more sense when I repeat it. He said it's just like curling.
Watching curling.
Listen. Phyllis has been telling me for some time that Paul is close to losing it. I think he just crossed the line. Pray for him. Don't judge him. And so because I don't know the difference between chickens or dogs or anything else, I have learned that I am simply unqualified to judge. And that's essentially what Jesus is saying in these first few verses of Matthew chapter 7. Let's read the first couple of verses. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. I may be wrong, but I think that judging others is a particular temptation for Christian people who are trying to live the right way. We've been studying the Sermon on the Mount now, 3 years? It seems like it. Let's say you decided, you know what? If this is how kingdom people are supposed to live, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to work on my meekness. I am going to work on practicing my righteousness only before God. I am going to learn some of these things that have been shared with me in the Sermon on the Mount, and I am going to do my dead level best to live by them. I'm going to hunger and thirst for righteousness. And when you make that decision, you may find out that not everybody else is quite as committed as you are to that. And there is this particular temptation in that kind of scenario to think, obviously, they don't take the Sermon on the Mount very seriously. Maybe I should explain it to them. And I've had plenty of times explained to me, I assure you. It's just a temptation for people who take Christianity seriously. Now, they're not the only ones. I know a lot of judgmental people who've never even heard of Christianity. So it doesn't have to be Christian people. I'm only going to tell you that when you look at these things and take them seriously, you have a tendency to evaluate others in terms of what you have decided to do. And a lot of times they just don't measure up. Sometimes when people make a decision to live for the Lord and they see somebody being just a little on the worldly side, they think, oh man, I missed that. Have you ever seen anybody who start talking about their previous life before they became a Christian, and you can just see this faraway look in their eyes? Yeah, I was a real ringtail tutor, I'll tell you. Oh yeah, but okay, no, I'm through with that. Maybe not emotionally, but at least physically, they're through with that. Our Lord is talking here about evaluating or discerning without being judgmental. We are going to learn tonight that right judging is necessary and expected in the Christian life. I gave you the passage, John 7 and verse 24. Anybody look that up? It's a situation in which the religious leaders were accusing Jesus of not giving enough weight to the Sabbath law because he performed a miracle and healed a person on the Sabbath day. And he said, you know what? If your baby is born on Friday, 8 days later is the Sabbath, you go ahead and circumcise him. If you can do that for him, why can't I heal the whole body? And then he says, I think I wrote it down here, yes. Stop judging by appearances and make a right judgment. So you've got this. Don't judge. Make a right judgment. So there's something in the tension between those two that I'm hoping we'll come to a better understanding of after the lesson is over tonight. It's this right judgment which is very difficult for us to do, but very necessary for us to do. Why are we sometimes not qualified to judge? Why might we make mistakes when we're evaluating people or judging people? One of the things is we will not know all the circumstances involved. Have you ever thought of that? You might make a decision about somebody and not really realize. How many of you ever read the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People? I would recommend that book very highly. He gives an example of a guy on a bus with kids that are running wild. And the person sitting there thinks, why in the world doesn't he control it? And he found out the guy had just lost his wife. She just died at the hospital, and he was on his way home and just in a complete fog, wondering what in the world is he going to do. Sometimes we don't know the circumstances that are involved with other people's lives. And sometimes we may not know how the Lord really feels about some issues. You may think you do, but you may be wrong. For instance, in the book of Romans in chapter 14, I think this is in your notes as well, it has to do, the whole chapter basically has to do with what kind of things can you do and what kinds of things can't you do. Some people took the eating of meat that had been offered to idols as something that was absolutely horrific to do. And other people thought, hey, a cow's a cow. You know, what's the difference? And yet they were judging one another over that, and it was causing great friction in the church at Rome. And Paul said, you need to get out of that business. You know, the guy who doesn't want to eat that meat does so because he thinks he honors the Lord in doing that. And the fellow who thinks it's okay to eat that meat, when he has it on his plate, he bows his head and gives thanks to God. Both of them are acknowledging the Lord. So just quit judging one another about stuff like that. We may not always know what the Lord wants. Now I'm going to share with you a very personal story and say some things that I'll probably wish weren't on the video. Can you cut? No, I'm kidding. A little bit, I'm kidding. I lived in Vernon for 9 years. Y'all know where Vernon is? Just the other side of Wichita Falls, about 50 miles. It's not the end of the world, but you can see the end of the world from Vernon, okay? And while I was there, we had 2 building programs. We added this to the auditorium because we needed more room. And then we also built new offices and this wonderful fellowship room. It was beautiful. You could probably seat 250 people in there. We used it for funeral meals, for fellowship meals, when the congregation got together and stuff like that. It was beautiful. There was another, and it's a Church of Christ. That's where I spent most of my time. Don't judge me. In that town, there was a lot smaller church. And they were very conservative. Now, I'm not saying that's bad. I'm just saying that's what they were, okay? And the preacher for that church every week on Fridays had an article in the paper. And 3 out of 4 articles were always aimed at us. There wasn't enough sin in the town. He had to take shots at us. And finally, I decided to get on the phone with him. And I said, what rationale do you have for attacking us in the newspaper like this? Well, it's because you're not following the Bible. I said, okay. Tell me more. He said, well, that big building you got up there, that fellowship hall where y'all eat together and stuff, that's wrong. I said, okay. He said, do you not know what 1 Corinthians chapter 11 says? And by the way, if you don't know what 1 Corinthians chapter 11 is about, that church, we should study Corinthians. We did once before. Oh gosh, a church with problems. That church was having such issues with, because the Lord's Supper was always served in the context of a meal. And the rich folks who didn't have to work got there, started eating. Some of them got drunk on the wine. And then the poor folks who had to work all day showed up and there was nothing left for them. And Paul says, and here's the sentence, do you not have houses to eat and drink in? That's the question he asks in verse 22 of chapter 11. Clearly, the context is you don't have to come up to church to gorge and get drunk. Don't you have houses to eat and drink in? And I said, so the application of that, I'm playing dumb, which is easy for me. I do it well. He said, you're supposed to eat in your houses, not at the church building. I said, okay. I said, well, if you don't mind, just let me ask you a couple of questions. I said, do you have a water fountain in your church building? He said, what's that got to do with anything? Paul says, do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Oh, come on, water doesn't count. I don't know why. Well, you have to have water. People have to have water. They can't go 2 hours without water. Well, Paula couldn't, but, most people can. Anyway, that kind of got him mad at me. And then I said, do you and your wife ever go to the restaurant? And now he knows where I'm going with this. I said, well, if Paul says, do you not have houses to eat in, why don't you eat in your house and not go to a restaurant? Well, it went downhill from there. I don't think I won him over. The articles continued, but that was our last conversation about that. So, both of us felt like that we had a biblical understanding of what God's priorities were, but they were very different. Listen, I'm pretty sure that his theology was wrong, but I can tell you for an absolute positive that his methodology was wrong. Jesus says, if you have a problem with a brother, what do? You go to him alone, privately discuss it with him. And I think that excludes putting it in the newspaper. But anyway, like I said, I don't think I won him over. However, Jesus is not advocating that there should not be some kind of moral discernment in connection with this thing of judge not lest you be judged. By the way, that is some people's favorite verse in all of the Bible. Not John 3:16, but Matthew 7 verse 1. Because you say something to them. Bill, do you think it's okay for you to be canoodling your secretary like that? Judge not, lest you be judged. You can't say anything to anybody about any kind of issue that they might have in their life because you can't judge. If you think that Jesus saying, do not judge, means that, you don't know Jesus. Do not judge is not to be interpreted like we commonly understand it today. We still have to practice moral discernment, because if that's not what Jesus meant, then he is a total hypocrite in what he says in the Sermon on the Mount. Did you hear that? Because Jesus judged all the time. If you look back in the Sermon on the Mount, just to start with, he says, your righteousness needs to exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. Why? Because they love to stand on the street corners and show off. Do you get the impression that Jesus thought that was wrong? And he said it out loud and said, don't you be like that, because that's a bad thing to do? All through the Sermon on the Mount, and later in chapter 7, he'll say, be on your guard for false prophets. Well, how do you know what a false prophet is if there's no standard for rightness? Jesus had a very strong sense of rightness, and if you read the entire New Testament with that in mind, you have to know that 7, 1, and 2 don't mean what we use. You know, it's like in our world. This is going to sound kind of old school thing. There's nothing more important than tolerance. Well, I read an article about a fellow who taught an ethics class in a Canadian university. And his senior ethics students always gave the impression that they didn't really have any kind of moral ground to make decisions on. So finally he decided to give them an example. He said, I read about a 14-year-old Afghan girl, is that the adjective? Who was given to a Taliban fighter when she was 14 years old. He mistreated her brutally. He kept her with his cattle tied up in a pen. She ran away once, and when he caught her, he mutilated her. Now, what do you think of that? And one student said, well, it sounds wrong to me, but who am I to judge other cultures? He said, do you know how hard it is to teach ethics when there is no floor for ethics? Nothing is really right and nothing is really wrong. It's all, well, it could be this and it could be that. Well, over there it's this way and over here it's this way. And he was bemoaning the fact that, that we just can hardly speak a word of condemnation about anything because we're a tolerant people. Then Stephen Anderson, I'm sorry. And then an evangelist by the name of J.P. Moreland, who works mostly with college students, was at the University of Vermont several years ago. And he was teaching in a dorm room about Jesus, leading to the conclusion that Jesus must be the very Son of God based on the evidence that he presented. A student who lived in that same dorm room said, well, that might be true for you, but it's not necessarily true for us. You can't lay your understanding of truth on other people. He was getting ready to leave, and he noticed that there was a nice stereo system in the room, so he went over, unplugged it, and started to leave with the stereo. Hey, said that same student, what are you doing? He said, I'm taking this stereo. Why? He said, that's my stereo. You can't do that. Oh, you're going to foist your sense of right and wrong on me? He said, I basically see it as not so much you're stealing my stereo as I like that stereo and I'm going to take it. You know, we think differently about it. Well, I will tell you that 3 weeks after that event, that young man became a Christian, which is one of the things he reported in the little booklet that he wrote about it. And he later started a new ministry called Stealing Stereos for Jesus, which I think can be a very effective ministry. You might consider that, or not. So, when I examine the life of Jesus and his teachings and what he said, I see him over and over again calling out selfish behavior, bad theology. He did in the Sermon on the Mount, remember? You heard that it was said, but that's wrong. Here's what I tell you is the real thing. So Jesus criticized habits, he criticized theology, he criticized attitudes, and he criticized sin. He used the S word, which you can call it sin, but it's really just a matter. No, it's not. So, we have to keep that in mind when we think about what judgment really is. Let me go on. I will come back to that, but let me go on. In verses 3 through 5, he says, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? Here comes judgment. You hypocrite! That's a judgment. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. I said to Paula, get me a plank for this week, because I want to show what that looks like. And I didn't get a plank. She ordered from Kroger's, and apparently they were all planks. I don't know any other way to explain it. But it's supposed to be a humorous looking. Can you imagine a guy who can't even get close to you because he's got this giant board in his eye trying to get a little speck of sawdust out of somebody else's eye? And Jesus says, that's what I see a lot of times. I see these Pharisees who have big planks in their eyes trying to deal with little bitty sins in other people's lives because they think that's their job. They're like NBA referees looking for fouls. You know, got the whistle ready to blow. When I see a foul, I call it. And that's what they were like too often in the first century. What Jesus is warning against, and I hope you'll hear this, he is warning against a sharp, critical, censorious spirit which finds the worst in nearly everything and everybody. And if you've known that kind of person, or if you are that kind of person, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. Now, there are obviously degrees of this. Paula and I have different degrees. I'm going to let you guess which one is which. I knew they'd mess that up, Paula. Just kidding. Some people are pretty good at seeing the best in situations. You've heard about the lady who, when she went to a funeral, I'm sorry for this old story, every time she went to a funeral, she always went by the casket and said something good about the person. You know that? And one day the town drunk died, literally, in the gutter, found him 3 days after he died. They had a funeral, and everybody who went to the funeral wondered, well, I wonder what she'll say about this guy. And as she passed by, she patted his hand and said, doesn't he look better since he quit drinking? I know it's old. I know it's old. But it's classic. Because when you want to say something good, if that's your nature, you can usually find something good. But you could even have a preacher die and somebody go by and say something bad about him. I'm looking for the most they're all likely, Paul. Okay, I'll just have to let that go. Jesus says that when we have an obvious sin in our lives and then try to be critical of others, it's just crazy to do that. I'll tell you another story. In one of the churches where I preached, this young man, probably early 20s, his parents were members of my congregation, and he was as a kid. But then he left, and he was living with his pregnant girlfriend. He was supplementing his income by selling drugs. But he had a job, and on the job one day, he started attacking a fellow worker about not having the right to call their preacher pastor. Now, theologically wise, we can talk about that. I think there's some merit in that reality. However, how does somebody living that kind of lifestyle want to correct somebody who is in church every single Sunday and dedicated his life to the Lord? It makes no sense. And what do you think that does for the reputation of the church that he came from? I noticed when I said that I started out in Churches of Christ, a few of you flinched. I will tell you that for me, there are a lot of wonderful things about the Church of Christ, and there are some things that aren't very good. And Paul and I try to manifest the things that are good. Now, we spent 15 years in a non-Church of Christ setting, and now we have fallen back into, sin, and now we're going to another one. But be that as it may, we in Churches of Christ too often are known for being self-righteous and critical of others. And some people see that in terms of, well, we got to tell people the truth. Whew. They can't hear you for the arrogance that you manifest when you talk to them about it. So, I'm acknowledging that so that you know that that's how I feel. Now, verse 6. I'm going fast. Notice that. Because I was going to cover 11 verses, but I'm not. So I'm just going to cover verse 6. Do not give dogs what is sacred. Do not throw your pearls to pigs. If you do, they may trample them under their feet and then turn and tear you to pieces. What does that mean? Don't give dogs what is sacred. I don't know if he's talking about, I don't know. Or don't throw your pearls to Pigs. Because, see, the pigs may figure out that this ain't food and you tried to fool them, and they're not going to be happy about it. They'll attack you. Here's what I understand the passage to mean. When you try to suggest good, godly principles to people who have absolutely no interest in them whatsoever, it's not going to go well. And what that means is, you're going to have to judge what is a good situation to offer and when it's not. Does everybody understand that? You look around and see if they're dogs or pigs. And if they are, I think Jesus practiced this in his ministry. I mean, this is an unusual example, but if you know what happened in John chapter 3, Jesus spent a long time talking to Nicodemus at night, in the dark, when he could have been sleeping. But I think he'd have talked all night with Nicodemus. Why? Because Nicodemus was a seeker. But when they brought him in his trial and stuck him in front of Herod, and Herod started asking him all these questions, do you know what Jesus said? Nothing. Nothing. Now, he didn't say you're a pig or a swine or a dog, and no. He didn't believe that sharing a truth of his nature before Herod was of any value whatsoever. And this requires discernment on our part. And discernment that shouldn't be made quickly. Well, I tried to talk to Harry once and he wasn't interested, so I just called him a pig and turned around. No. That's not what we're talking about here. But after a while, when you realize that you are wasting your time, the thing to do, I believe, is to just live out kingdom life in their presence. And let that do. Until they come to you and say, by the way, I noticed this and this. Why? Then you get a chance to talk. But that requires spiritual discernment and, in a very real sense, judging whether or not that person should be talked to. When Jesus was on the earth, his disciples, he sent them out on what is called the limited commission. Not the great one, but the limited commission. And when he did, he said, you go into such and such a town, preach the gospel, heal people, do all kinds of good. And if you are not received well in that town, what do?
The dust off.
You shake the dust off your feet and go somewhere else. You look for receptivity. And obviously, Jesus is saying sometimes people are not receptive. So Jesus taught his disciples that, and certainly the Apostle Paul demonstrated that in his missionary journeys. I think I showed you or told you that in Acts chapter 13, there's a good example of that. Paul and his companion were in Antioch. And they had a great meeting on the Sabbath day. And they were invited back the next Sabbath day to teach some more about Jesus. And it says, on the next Sabbath, almost the whole city gathered to hear the word of the Lord. When the Jews saw these crowds, they were filled with jealousy. They began to contradict what Paul was saying and heaped abuse on him. Then Paul and Barnabas answered them boldly. We had to speak the word of God to you first. Since you reject it and do not consider yourselves worthy of eternal life, I love that, we now turn to the Gentiles. God's plan was for you to hear it first, so we shared it with you, but you don't consider yourself worthy of eternal life. That's a backhanded compliment. So we're going to the Gentiles. In that story, I think Paul is manifesting what Jesus says in verse 6. You look for receptivity for the message of God, and if it's not there, you move on. Again, you don't give up on people, but sometimes, as I said, you have to model kingdom life in front of them and hope that makes a difference. Don't give up doing that. I don't know if I'm ready to do the three. I guess I am, because it's going to take me just a minute to do these. I tried to give you 3 things to remember. Not because that's a sermon, but give you 3 things to remember. Number 1, we need to spend less time judging and more time helping other people. For a church to be known as a church that looks to help people, you've got a head start on making a difference in that community. Our struggling fellow Christians can use all the help that they can get. And if every time they show any kind of weakness, they get scorned for their weakness, that's not the way it ought to be. We need to be a people who is more concerned about helping people than we are of judging people. I fear that we are going to become like those Jesus described in Luke 11:46, and these are fearful words. You experts in the law, woe to you, because you load people down with burdens they can hardly carry, and you yourselves will not lift one finger to help them. The burdens that they gave them may have been the law of God. It really might have. But when you do that and you're not willing to help them to carry out God's will for their lives, you have missed the boat. Everybody understand that? We need to be people who are quick to help and slow to judge. Secondly, wait a minute. I want to make sure I don't get this wrong. Paula, you've got to make your notes clear. Okay. Before we try to help anybody else, let's try to clean up our own act. The humor of the plank and the speck it's laughable, but there's a reality there. It is much easier for us to see sins in others than in ourselves. Is that right? I'm really good at seeing sin in other people. I majored in that. Got a degree in that. I'm reminded of what happened in the Old Testament when David had that horrible, horrible time in his life. When he committed adultery with the wife of one of his trusted army guys. And then when he was afraid that it was going to be found out, he decided the best way to handle this is to kill my army guy. And I think he thought, well, I've gotten by with that. Nobody called me out on it, so I guess I'm good. I don't know how much time went by, but eventually a fellow named Nathan, you remember Nathan? Nathan showed up and said, David, let me tell you about something that's going on in the kingdom right now. There's this rich guy who's got flocks of sheep, and he lives next door to a husband and wife who've got one little lamb. And when the rich guy had company come, he went and killed that little lamb and brought him over to feed his guest. What do you think of that? Boy, David was riled up. He couldn't believe that somebody would do something like that, and he pronounces the severest judgment on that family. And Nathan says, I'm talking about you. And David said, I didn't see that coming. He didn't. He had done something much worse. But apparently he had socked that away enough that he could get angry at a guy who killed a pet lamb from a family when he had killed his buddy in the military service and taken his wife. I'm going to try to recite this little poem that many of you have heard before. But some of you haven't. I dreamed death came the other night, and heaven's gate swung wide. With kindly grace, an angel came and welcomed me inside. Well, there to my astonishment stood folks I'd known on earth, and some I judged and called unfit, and some of little worth. Indignant words rose to my lips, but never were set free, for every face showed stunned surprise. No one expected me. And that poem has helped me. We think, well, they're not worthy. They're not worthy. You know what? People may look at you and think, well, you're not worthy either. But we don't see it. And so we go around judging others, and maybe it's a speck, maybe it's a bigger stick, I don't know, but get the plank out of your eye before you do that. It is far more important to focus on our efforts to be kingdom people before we go around trying to shape up other people. That's number 2. Number 3, there is a divinely ordained standard of what is right and what is wrong. And we must stand for godly principles regardless of the cost. The Bible says that there is a day of judgment coming. When Paul preaches in Athens, he said that God has set a day where he will judge the world by the one whom he raised from the dead. That would be Jesus. So there is judgment, a final judgment, but we won't be doing it. And we don't need to practice while we're here. That is something that God is going to be doing. And if we decide that we need to go to somebody and talk to them, I think it's important that we decide, what are you trying to accomplish in going to that person? 2 biblical episodes, and then we'll quit. When Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, he dealt with a lot of problems in that church. And he gets to chapter 5, and I'm not saying exactly like Paul says it, but it's close. He said, you know what I heard? I heard there's something going on in your congregation that would make the pagans blush. There is a man in that church who is living with his father's wife. And you're proud of it. I don't know how that happened. You know what you need to do? Get rid of him. That's way too judgmental, Paul. No, it wasn't. Because his immorality was affecting the church in a negative way. You know how it is. Well, if he can get away with that, I should be able to get away with this. And then he explains later on, why do you kick him out? Because you want to ruin him? No. You're hopeful that that will cause him to be restored to the church because he misses the fellowship of the family of God so much. So even when you, quote, judge a person, you do it with the idea of restoration. And anytime we go to someone, if we feel like we can help someone and get them back on the right path, you always have to go not with the idea of making them feel bad. You go with the idea of restoring them to the life that God called them to. Do we understand that? I'll give you one example. Most of us know the story real well of John chapter 8, where Jesus was just talking with his disciples, and here comes a group of Pharisees, and they're dragging a woman. Remember? We caught this woman in the very act. There's no way to justify what she was doing. It was adultery, pure and simple. The law says we're to stone her. What do you say? Now that story is introduced with words something like this. They brought Jesus this woman to test him. That's not a good, anyway. And of course we all know what Jesus said, let him who is without sin cast the first stone. And I think it's funny that they all started to leave, starting from the oldest to the youngest. And you draw your own conclusions about that. And finally, nobody was left but Jesus and the woman. Where are your accusers? They're gone. Neither do I condemn you. What comes next? Go and sin no more. Lady, I am not trying to say that what you're doing is right. It isn't. But I want you to be restored to the life that God has designed for you to have. So quit this. Find something better. Look for the love of God in your life and let that be what molds you. Jesus was a wonderful person in being able to condemn sin without condemning the sinner. His desire was to restore people when they got caught in sin. And that should be ours as well. So those three things. Number one, get the beam out of your own eye before you go hunting for somebody else's. Number two, and that's on this page that I turned. Before we help, no, that's the first one was we need to spend less time judging and more time helping. I'm sorry. Then we have to get the plank out of our own eye before we do that. And then we have to understand that there is indeed a standard of right and wrong. The society which is afraid to condemn anything as wrong is adrift. And in many ways, we're there. It's like that ethics teacher at the Canadian University. How do you teach ethics to a group of people who have no ground for morality? Well, yeah, it could be wrong for us, but it's not necessarily wrong for them. And I think as Christian people, we ought to say, no. There is a standard. And that God will judge people by his standard. You know, we know that there's certain right and ways in all kinds of things, in mathematics and in engineering, but in ethics, well, it just depends. It depends on what God says, and I hope that we'll take that to heart. All right, that's all I got to say about that. I probably will go home and say, oh man, I should have said something about that. Paula, why didn't you make this type bigger so I would have noticed it? I will be glad to hear what you have to say. Nobody? All right, Paul, I'm going to judge that they didn't listen.